Hey everyone, just waiting in for a few more people to join before we start the meeting. Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Working Group LTS meeting. This meeting is getting recorded, so um, please be nice to everyone. We follow the CNCF Code of Conduct guidelines, and I expect all the members to do that. I wanted to start the agenda quickly today, but I'm not sure if we have quorum. Tim, do you have any comments? Nick, we only have organizers in today, and Lubomir is the only member.
To talk about from last time.
I can't hear you.
I can't quite hear you.
That's right. Oh, sorry. It only took me a minute to start talking. I think it is building up and where we're up to with that. But aside from that, that's the business I have, I guess.
There was a bunch of noise right in the middle of what you said on my end again, so I didn't quite hear it again.
That's all right. Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, I'd definitely like to have like us all to talk about where we're up to with the CAP. I think it is pretty important to keep that moving along.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, I think last week we decided that we would spend the working group time in editing the doc directly during the meeting. That way we can chalk out all the points together and discuss everything instead of having too many drafts and changing them. Yep. The changes I think I have made to the doc is okay. Let me share the URL. If you're an attendee, you can find the link of the doc, the agenda meeting doc, and add yourself as an attendee there. Anybody wants to be a note taker? Raise your hand. Raise your right hand. Okay.
I can jot notesing down a bit as we're going.
Thanks, Tim.
I feel a bit bad that I've not been to the last few of these meetings for a variety of reasons. So if you want to, as penance, I can take minutes. And if you're anything like me, I struggle to kind of talk and take minutes at the same time. So you guys talk more than I do. I'm happy to take minutes.
Okay, go for it.
Thanks, Quentin. Let me start with the agenda, the talk. Looking for the link. So I've pasted the link for the KEP doc here. I've made some changes. I've changed the sections to match the KEP structure. And I did work on some data for the survey. I'm still in the process of doing it, so I don't have much updates there. I'm not linked anything here yet. I've added a benefits section to get started on what are the benefits for the KEP, and I think the impacts section could slowly merge into the details section as and when we learn more, because I saw there was a lot of mapping between the details, different sections inside the details and the impact. So an impact is also does not match the KEP format. So that makes a huge I think the first benefit is 1 year of full support. And the second benefit, I think, is overlay period for transitioning or upgrading to a new version. One of the other changes I made was, instead of calling it as yearly support cadence, I call it as yearly support period, because I think it's more periodic than cadence. Cadence is more tied to releases. We're not changing the release cadence. Release cadence is still 3 months. The support period that is changing from 9 months to 1 year and 12 plus 2. And I wanted to reword some of the sections where we define what the 14 months proposed period. So how do we define what those 12 months are and what those 2 months are? Like what's going to be supported in the 12 months and what's going to be supported in 2 months.
Well, the idea is that it's 4 versions, right, rather than 12 months. 4 versions plus 2 months for upgrades is the idea, right? Rather than actually 12 months.
Yes, and I remember Stephen had some comment in the SIG release around that we actually followed 12 months. Tim, you want to say something?
I think so. I feel like that benefit, 1 year of support, is actually something that people want, as opposed to whether it's 2 or 3 or 17 version releases. It's a pattern in industry to look for support on the scale of year plus.
Yeah.
So like for example, if you look at Golang, it's a different number of releases that they support, but a similar time duration. I think the time duration is the more abstract benefit concept there.
Yeah, I think I can't help thinking that it's actually both that are important. You know, in some sense, if you have to changes very infrequently, then supporting the previous version, if these versions last like 5 years, is perfectly reasonable. I think one of the drivers is just how much and how quickly things change, and therefore keeping it as short as 1 year makes some sense, because you're already 4 versions behind. So I guess I would suggest we sort of mention both. It's not one or the other, it's both that are important.
Yeah, I agree. I was more saying that the 4 releases is kind of the thing that we will implement to be able to get the 12 months.
Yeah, makes sense. I was actually curious, does anyone know that there was talk at some point of trying to speed up the release cycle for Kubernetes? 3 months was seen as too long, and it was too heavyweight and blah, blah, blah.
there was Tim Sinclair had a proposal to move to like a develop stable style release cadence. This is kind of the, for lack of a better word, MVP proposal that like both Lubomir also has a proposal to do a more traditional sort of LTS, but both of them there's a lot sort of required to be able to get to the point where we can really usefully look at either one of them. And this is sort of this is like MVP for, hey, this is something that we can do reasonably cheaply, and get some of the value and get some value for people based on the survey. Kind of the
just to be clear, the context of my question was, I seem to recall, and I might be wrong, and I don't know if the thinking has changed, but there was talk of, this stable release would perhaps change every month, as opposed to every 3 months. And if that was the case, are we still wanting to have a 1 year LTS cycle, or would that affect it in any way, in that the LTS would be like 12 versions behind or whatever?
I don't believe anything conclusive has come out of those discussions. It was like people throwing ideas out there and kind of aspirational ways, but more pragmatically over the past 6 months or so, there's been much better community documentation around what is the formal deprecation policy, and as that's been operated a little more rigorously, I think, I've not heard people say this explicitly, but I sense that there's a recognition that it would actually be a little hard for us right now to move to that sort of a monthly release or something that much faster, because of how it would change the version skew policy, deprecations, and that sort of thing. Right now, we're not, I don't want to say we're not, but we need more rigor around that change management policy within the code. And there've been, in any given week, there's something I see coming up somewhere where somebody's realizing, oh, that thing that we took out, or that thing that we basically all just agreed, let's take out now. Actually, we can't. We need to do a proper deprecation cycle for it and give it time. And that's gonna, if it's just a simple sort of like 2-3 versions or something, then things would get deprecated extremely quickly before people, like, knowledge is actually rippled out, which takes time as opposed to just releases. And then the deprecation policy does actually have a component of time. So it could become the case then where our deprecation policy is you have to keep something around for 12 releases. And I think right now people are struggling to remember to keep things around and clean up after themselves on a smaller scale. So I'm not confident in us going to something that rapid right now, given our processes around how we manage the changes within the code base for compatibility deprecations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. On the counter side, I guess most of my experience was Google and Amazon, these kind of things. Certainly at Google, the release cadence, even of like infrastructural components like Borg and these kind of things was way more frequent than quarterly. So, faced with all the same sort of problems, eventually they were solved, and the benefits and the application level stuff, certainly, search and ads and these kind of things. I mean, these things change almost daily. In fact, each microservice of those things changes, almost multiple times a week. So I would imagine we're going to get to much quicker than quarterly, ASAP. And even though, given all of those challenges you mentioned, that we would end that way. But anyway,
so one other data point that I noticed, this came up in a conversation last week. So if I go look at GKE or at Amazon EKS, neither of them have posted 114 conformance results yet. So to me, that's a sign, like, as I'm watching the Kubernetes distribution platform spreadsheet that the CNCF has around conformance results, I'm seeing more and more, even the major ones who we think of as being able to and actually moving quickly, moving slower. So as a data point, both Amazon and Google currently are on 113, which in 6 weeks goes end of life.
Yeah, that is interesting data. I was not aware of that, and I wasn't, to be clear, I was not indicating or suggesting that I disagreed with anything you said before, and it may be the fact that because of all the aforementioned problems with Kubernetes specifically, which I think some of them are not, fundamental problems that are unsolvable. They're just we have not solved them with our community and our workflows yet, and therefore anybody, even if it's Google, who has to, upgrade things, they're just not able to do it as fast as they can with other things like, Borg, for example. But yeah.
I think that's sort of the gist of it in my mind.
I think we also wanted to take up something that is visible, that you can see that, hey, here is the goal and you have to do these steps to do it. So we wanted to be more pragmatic and say, let's do it step by step. We do recognize the proposals from Tim Sinclair and Lubomir, and we take the portions that we can achieve faster. That's why I think we went with this approach, saying we recognize that is the ideal goal. I think Tim Sinclair's proposal of having monthly releases and a longer one, both in tandem, is kind of something which this project would need in the long term. But right now, to achieve that, there are hooks and challenges. In fact, to achieve what we have right now, we just, we look at the work towards getting this goal. So, yeah, I think it was more of a step approach.
Dhaval, the noise maybe is coming from your side, actually. You broke up a few times there, and Zoom was only showing like the mic level coming from you.
Bolt by any chance? It sounded like you'd just been overwhelmed by a hurricane.
Probably is my headset. I'm having issues with it in a couple of days. Sorry about that.
So I guess that was sort of one of the things I wanted to talk about, because that's the task that I have on the KEP document, is to sort of take a look over the two proposals and talk a little bit about why we're doing this instead of either of those. Lubomir, I saw you use the raise hand thing before. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about the 3 months release cycle, potentially reducing it. For someone like me who actually contributes to components and docs and test signal and everything, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people are not going to be happy if we decrease the release cycle. We simply don't have the time. We don't have the people to contribute and to work on stuff. Like last week I sent placeholder documentation PRs. Like this week I have to finish them. Next week it's like we lift cold freeze, we enter cold tau. Cold tau is like a couple of days. The schedule is super tight, even in the 3 months. If people go to PTO, we don't have people to work on stuff. So it's, that's the developer perspective. I'm sure that some SIGs are not going to be happy if we decrease change the cadence.
Yep. Yeah, I mean I think that that's that and amongst other things are sort of the reason why no one's really looking at we're talking about it, but we're not able to do it anytime in the next probably while, 6 months, I don't know, 12 months, something like that. There's a lot of work around the automation, the release process, tidying up the release. I mean, Tim and Dhaval are both release in active in SIG release. They can talk about actually the mechanics of doing a release we have in the past, and that's where I think all of this has come from. Is just this is kind of us being like, hey, we've been doing this LTS working group for almost a year. It's supposed to be time limited. Let's get something that will at least help with some of these things. I actually think that one of the outputs that we've ended up getting out of having this working group running for this year is that to really sort of do a bit of cross-SIG visibility of some of the issues around longer term supportability, as much as providing the concrete goals. I think having people like Jordan here who are across a large section of the project, but not all of it, and then having you, Tim, and you to sort of bring in some of the release stuff as well I felt like it's been really helpful for me, at least, just to have this place to be like, hey, let's at least think about this.
So I guess to that end, it's worth mentioning, I linked it in the minutes from last meeting. I had the to-do to make sure that we submitted something for the Contrib Summit coming up at KubeCon North America, just to kind of do a BOF sort of recap a year later. Where are we? What have we accomplished? And ideally, the intent was to talk about the KEP, and there's a link down there to the abstract we submitted to the Contrib Summit.
Awesome. So Quentin, does that sort of answer some of your questions about right?
Oh yeah, and sorry for derailing things. I'm as much catching up with thinking.
No. Just it's fine, man. Like it's good to have.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree that it's a complicated thing. It sounds like we're stuck with quarterly releases for some time, and around about 1 year is sort of sounds like where LTS is aiming, and that seems reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, we do have some data from the survey that Double was collating that sort of indicates, that sort of thing, the sort of time frame that people who are actually using Cube would expect. I mean, and speaking as someone who has been a long-term user of Cube, like that, a year is definitely something that more enterprisey places would do. When I was at Atlassian, like we specifically built our process so that we didn't need to stick for a year, but keeping up with even 3 monthly release cycles there was starting to get tough because the upgrade.
I guess my bigger question was really if Kubernetes were to move to a monthly or weekly or something other than quarterly, would that materially affect our 1 year LTS cycle? And I think the answer is no, it wouldn't. We would just do 1 year, which is 12 releases now, instead of 1 year, which is 4 releases. But people still need a year to kind of absorb the stuff into their enterprises, which is reasonable. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me now? Am I still noisy?
Yep. You sound fine.
What I did was I actually added in the KEP and the non-goals that we don't want to touch the release cadence right now. So that way, any question that someone has about, hey, are we changing the release cadence, is out from this KEP, not from the opinions of this working group, but from this particular KEP that is only focusing on the support period right now. Also, I think we battle tested some of these points. We had a huge discussion with SIG release where we had lots of people from the community actually, we wanted to throw this idea and say, hey, how do you think if we change this and if we change this? And we had lots of anxiety and a lot of people come out and say, hey, this is too much, let's reduce it. I mean, there was a point on doing skip upgrades, upgrade faster, being able to skip upgrade from a version to N+2. So we had even anxiety, and we had people give very genuine reasons. Our testing is not there, our upgrade testing is not yet where we want it to be, or so there were a lot of data points there. So I think it makes sense. And Quentin, do you have the doc open that we have for the KEP?
I do, and I haven't read it yet, but I should probably do that to avoid any more stupid questions from me. So
no, I just added that section, so it should be cool.
I'll whiz through it quickly and make sure I can avoid dumb questions that are already answered in the KEP.
I've added a section inside details that says support policy during the first 12 months. I think, should we, so the way I wanted to word it right now over here is to say, same as the older support policy in 9 months, and differ the definition to existing policy. How does that sound?
I wanted to add a comment here. Like previously, I talked about this. To some consumers of Kubernetes, the increase from 9 to 12 it's probably not going to sound like LTS. It's just another release. And my thinking was that people want 2 years or something like that of support. So I just wanted to add this comment, like, is this really LTS? Like having one release more?
I was actually coincidentally about to make exactly the same comment. The difference between 9 and 12 seems so small, and it's actually 9 and 14, I guess. But even so, it's kind of like, it's not a big enough change that it fundamentally affects people, I would imagine.
That's actually the idea, is that it's not a big enough change that too many things are going to have to change, but it will help. It will help by making it, because a lot of people do have sort of at least a yearly cycle. Like, they'll be able to do upgrades, at a certain period before the Christmas rush because they're in retail, or they're, finance, and they won't be able to do upgrades during tax, but they will be able to just after, or something like that, right? Like lots of companies, because they tend to have a yearly cadence for their business, they tend to have especially if they're highly regulated, they tend to have a yearly cadence for their big release windows. And so that's been the feedback that I have. I don't know about anyone else, but that's what I've heard. Sorry, Tim.
I was just going to add that one of the things that we said from the beginning is that we weren't presupposing we were going to end up at what people think of traditionally as LTS. We're not saying that one of these releases would be picked for a extremely long-term support, but rather that all would get the sort of year plus, so that you can pick which one you want and do your migrations based on your calendar on an annual cadence. That feels like a pragmatic middle ground, but it also doesn't preclude, if over time the project has matured and we're finding that it's viable to do even longer support, I can totally imagine at some point the community deciding, hey, let's go ahead and pick one of them each year that we support for 2 or 3, or who knows, like Linux things over time, like even more than that. But I think, technically speaking, where the project is in terms of like so many APIs on alpha and beta still, for example, like that sort of support is just not really tenable today, but in the future it certainly could be.
Yeah.
I think if you look at the KEP itself, it's not called an LTS proposal. It's still called the yearly support cadence, and the idea is to at least cater to the customers who are looking for at least a full year of support, or multiple. I mean, define support in terms of in the currency of years rather than.
So I think I'm going to put a sentence there in the non-goals to say this is like not what you think of normally as LTS.
Yeah,
just to make it clear, and maybe that's the only place that the letters LTS show up in this KEP, but to make it explicit.
And just to be clear, my comment was not actually aimed at saying this is not LTS. My comment was just 14 months is not much different than 9. But
yeah, I think it's actually an important, like, even if that wasn't your intent, like all of us sort of heard that partly, it's an important recognition, because this has been a part of the conversations, and to say this isn't those normal letters, what you think when you normally see those letters LTS.
I think Nick's comment is very valid, though, that there's some magic around 12 months. I mean, financial cycles are 12 months, holiday cycles are 12 months, retail cycles are 12 months. And the 9-month thing actually was a technically driven thing. It was, Google has quarterly OKRs, and a lot of people think quarterly, and quarterly releases kind of make some amount of sense. And the technicalities of how many you have to support, versions, because of version skews between masters and nodes, etc., meant that 3 was the number that kind of came out, I guess. And so we ended up with a slightly weird number, which doesn't correspond with financial cycles, retail cycles, and holiday cycles. And so one could simplify, the proposal in saying we're just trying to fix that problem. Does that make sense, what I just said? And sorry, coming into this so late and not having been part of the conversation.
That's exactly what the goals and non-goals are achieving. Saying that we want to target, hey, we are targeting the yearly support cadence. That's what the first goal says. And the non-goals are saying we are not redefining the release cadence. We are not touching the release cadence. And that's why I think the document is covering that. Of course, again, the definition of what do we mean by support is pretty critical here.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's that's where some of the stuff that I need to put into the actual KEP about the Lubomir's and Tim St. Clair's proposals is to sort of say, here's some of the things that with as part of thinking about these proposals we thought about, and here's and quick and in a very short way, here are some of the problems that we found, which are then going to be sort of, which then also need to be reflected, but that includes a whole bunch of that sort of stuff. One of the things that we determined earlier on that was a pretty big blocker to doing any longer term support is the that all of the core APIs need to be GA. A whole bunch of the associated APIs need to be GA. Like and there's just not there's not enough APIs that are GA to do it. That was one of the big reasons. The other stuff is about practicalities, about test matrices, release tooling, like the automation of the release process. The work is just not done yet. It is all recognize that it needs to be done, but it's not done yet, and so we can't do anything more than this right now. But this will help people, and so that's why we should do something to help people.
Yeah, I think when you look at the proposals of Tim and Lubomir, I think they were hovering around 18 months of support for LTS. 14 months is not very far away from there. So I still think we are catering to a lot of those needs and to many of those users from the user community. So it does help. And as we make these changes, we will be talking about this during KubeCon. We will hear feedback from people saying, "Hey, we need more." And that's when people will understand. I think the talk during KubeCon will explain people what the support policy is, what the deprecation policy is, how the rest of the user community is thinking about it, and we will understand stronger voices coming out from the community that will say, "Hey, 14 months is not enough for me." And that's when we have to go back to the board and say, "Hey, the users are asking for more." Right now, I think there is. This is kind of a stepped approach to say, okay, this might be the next good and achievable goal for this project. Especially, like Tim mentioned, the component changes. I mean, if you want to support, as Quinton mentioned, we chose 3 months because 3 releases because we wanted to make sure the SKUs between master and client are not more than 2, and that looked like a good number. And now it's going to be 3, so it's going to be huge support change, and each 6 will have to go and look back at all their CLIs and say, what should be my version SKUs. Quinton, if you see all the current in the details section, we have actually listed some of those. The component changes of how SKU will be managed between different components with CTL, kubelet, and API servers, etc., and which SIGs are important there, and what we're going to do about approaching those SIGs to discuss this particular changes. I think if we go to them saying, okay, plus 14, more than 14 months, that SKU would mean, because the SIGs look at it as per release, that would mean they are looking at a different, a longer SKU there. So that creates a question of whether you can support longer or not. So I think starting with 1 extra release would actually be an easier step for them to do.
I'll go through the KEP and I'll add my comments in writing there. I feel very guilty about having chirping in from the sidelines here. I had one last question which might benefit from some interactive chat, which is, so if I understand correctly, we're not proposing skip a version option. So you have to upgrade incrementally through every version, which I 100% support. I think that's great. But does that imply, therefore, that at the very least, if there are 4 Kubernetes supports in a year, you have to upgrade your cluster 4 times in a year, and you could batch all of those updates to be after Christmas, but you would still have to do all 4 of them, or you could space them out and do them once per quarter. in which, you know, one argument that's going to come up is, well, if you have to upgrade every quarter anyway, or at least 4 times a year, shouldn't we just do that and move on with our lives? I'm just playing the devil's advocate. I'm very, very much in support of monotonic upgrades. I think that's great. I think in practice, people are not going to do monotonic upgrades in rapid succession, because they're going to want to go, you know, N+1 and then make sure that N+1 is actually working properly before they go to N+2, you know, the next version. And, you know, how long is that bake period? A few weeks, a few months. It sort of quickly becomes an argument. Isn't that a quarter actually? And then you're basically upgrading every quarter, and then the question becomes, yes, you can be a year behind, so you can still be upgrading to the release that came out a year ago, but you're still doing quarterly upgrades. And if that was what you were trying to avoid, you haven't got out of it.
Yeah,
You've just reduced a lag. You haven't actually reduced the frequency at which you have to upgrade your clusters.
I think the feedback that we got from people who in like industries like finance was that they would actually prefer to have just one big fat change window where, you know, like if, you know, where it's a month or so of them, you know, thrashing through 4 upgrades, and they are okay. They would prefer to be able to manage it themselves in that way. I mean, I would agree with you that, you know, I feel like they're going to have a bad time, but, you know, like they're the ones who know their business better.
They don't have an option today anyways. They don't have an option. They have to do 3 upgrades right now. In the future, they will be doing 4. But we are giving them an upgrade period. We are trying to right now they have an overlay period where they actually can get some support updates after 9 months. But with this 12+2, we're creating a pattern for them in which they develop into a good hygiene and a habit that says, okay, I'm getting 1 year, and then in this 2 months is when I do an upgrade. That's what I think this kind of model helps.
I think it goes back, Quentin, to your original comment about having that time limit in addition to the version SKU number that's sort of part of the overall support policy. A benefit there is keeping people from getting too far behind, and that's a risk. And we've never, I don't know as an industry software whether we have a great answer on how to motivate people to move forward versus staying put for too long to where they incur a huge pain then of moving forward eventually. So this is a small change. It is, even though it's small, it is close to a 2x difference in the pressure across the calendar. An enterprise can choose more actively when to put those change points into effect, but they still would need to do them.
I think the point Nick raised earlier is a very big one. The fact that you can actually plan on an annual cycle is a huge deal. You know, having worked at Amazon with their Christmas shopping, and, you know, everything is annual. And, you know, similarly, all big companies have, you know, Christmas holiday, you know, Thanksgiving, whatever it happens to be, where everybody's like away, and that's not when you do your big upgrade. And as soon as you have a non-annual cycle, you're kind of screwed, because if you're doing it every 9 months, you're basically going to end up over a period of a few years. You're going to do it in every single quarter, and that's precisely what people want to avoid. So I think that alone is a big deal, even if we just went from 9 months to 12.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
That's one of the primary reasons to do it. Yeah, it's just that it gives people, like, you know, that, hey, I can do my upgrades, you know, June every year is best for me, you know, and I can rely on being able to do a very big, annoying upgrade once a year. But that's actually better for me than having to try and do 3 monthly upgrades because I have some regulatory requirement or, you know, that sort of thing. Where, you know, if you think about a bunch of places like, you know, your defense or your whatever, like, you know, that they have, you know, they have requirements about how long, about, you know, certification of things and stuff like that, where, and again, this is all stuff where conformance is helps a bit already, and extending the conformance like people are planning on doing is going to help, but it's just not ready yet.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I agree. I was just sort of thinking through what the implications were and what problems we've solved and what problems we still haven't solved. And we still haven't solved, you can't just do one big upgrade every year. It's actually like 4 little upgrades at the same time. And arguably that's better because you can incrementally move forward. And if something goes pear-shaped with version N+3, you can just pause it there for a week while you fix it up or do whatever and then continue. And you've actually got like a whole kind of quarter to get through all of that stuff. And sometimes you can just push it all through in a day or a week or whatever. And in other cases, you might spread it out a bit further than that. I think that sounds great.
I think that's kind of the reason for the 2-month extra time. I think the target is 12 months, but the 2 months extra time is to allow people to sort of, hey, it's 12 months. I really, I've only got 2 months left. I really got to make sure that I pull my figure out.
Makes sense.
I like that point, Nick. Actually, that gives me a good segue onto some additions I made to the doc right now. Look at the support policy. I've again defined it saying, okay, support policy during first 12 months is same as what we have currently for the 9 months. To not redefine or word it here, and with the policy, by the time this document gets accepted, the policy upstream might change. So instead of defining and putting details here, we could probably link it there to 9 months. And the question here would be, what do we want to support for the +2 months? I've mentioned there only critical security patches, but since you have been in patch management and have been doing releases, what's your take on that? Lubomir, you have been on the receiving end of this. So what's your take on that?
So from my perspective, that's the policy, but so that being critical bug fixes. In practice, it's looser than that because it's left to the individual SIG's discretion. So even like right now in code freeze period, the SIGs are who applies the milestone label to determine what goes in during code freeze. So if a given SIG's leadership says, yes, this thing needs to go in to a patch release, it probably goes in. That said, we've had this fuzzy space where various SIGs at various times have tried to push in things that didn't pass kind of simple sniff test of criticality. So we have kind of a sliding scale then where we try to pragmatically decide what goes in. And I do think this is something that needs evolved over time to be more rigorous and have more clear criteria there. But historically, it's been on the shoulders of an individual, and the individual's usually kind of gone along with the SIG experts on it. And the longer we spread out the support lifetime of a given release, the more important it will be to add more rigor to the merge criteria.
So to just be clear, I only mentioned critical security patches. I've not called out critical bugs. So,
yeah, I think there it's still somewhat fuzzy. I think for the same rationale, people argue like, well, this is a bug, the thing could crash, that's a denial of service. Like people who want their fix will argue, people who want their feature will argue it's a bug, people who want their bug fix or feature will argue that the lack of it is a security issue. I mean, it's a slippery slope either way. And it's also unclear because like critical fix could imply CVEs only. And the number of CVEs going by is relatively low compared to the number of security issues that are dealt with in the public and not assigned a CVE, but are those still critical? They're security, but lacking a CVE, or if we say, does criticality require a CVSS score above 7.5 or something like that? And that also is subjective because like the Golang issue 2 weeks ago now, if you're running your cluster properly, I would say in an opinionated way, you have basically no exposure on this one, I believe. But it was also a relatively high CVSS score because you don't know for sure how somebody's running their thing relative to the DOS potential. So it remains fuzzy, even if you say critical security fixes on that.
How does I was trying to think of a way in which we become prescriptive and say the security SIG decides this +2 patches in this +2 months. Because this is outside, this is not the regular period. 9 months is the only support. I remember Stephen saying we are strictly doing 9 month support in the SIG release. We are not, overflowing. So this plus 2 months is new, and maybe this can just say critical security patches, and only people who can add labels are from SIG security.
Yeah, I disagree with Stephen there. I think we have always had this time skew. The CI wasn't immediately turned down because it didn't cost much, and we weren't sure if we wanted to leave this window open in case. And it was explicitly always said, it's not documented, but it's stated like the stuff's running for a time, and we would leverage that as a gap to sort of like a suspenders safety net sort of thing in case we needed it for some critical issue, not even security specific. Like maybe we discover slightly after the fact everybody's leaving 112 release and is having trouble upgrading all the way to 116 or even just 113. There's plenty of reason to think that that little bit of a safety net is useful. So we have always been doing that. This is just starting to formalize better the times and the content there. And as best I know, we have never actually exercised it in terms of having a truly required patch. We've made like there was a last 1.12 release this summer, trying to, and there wasn't something particularly critical in it to my recollection, but there was a backlog. People knew that people had been doing their due diligence, maybe even for a couple of months, trying to get their last patches into the last 1.12. And the review process takes a while. So there was like, it's almost like a guilt. Like we want to do a good job for the community. We want to make sure that people get their stuff merged. And it's not that person's fault in having submitted it, that things were slow. So we, just like the feature exception process for new enhancements, we have this window where you can say, hey, like, can I have an exception? I was a little bit late for these reasons. The risk can be assessed to be low, and we let the thing in. So we've always been doing that, I think.
I think we won't change if we don't discipline. I mean, one of the comments always Lubomir made was, we are not disciplined enough. So I think in this gap, by suggesting to only provide critical security patches, we are creating a stronger policy that the patch managers can rely on and hide behind if they feel guilty or if they are being, so, and take away the powers from the SIGs to actually decide what goes in those two SIGs. And they could approach SIG security like how they would approach SIG release today for getting their enhancements in for exceptions. But that needs to become a process rather than something that we understand it's flowing through the fingers right now. So could you define that much more clearly? Do you think only critical security patches as defined policy there makes sense, or do we want to define what security patches or CVSS level, etc.?
I think it's better to leave it as just to say critical security patches and leave it there, because otherwise we're going to end up submitting this KEP behind writing a policy.
Yeah.
Right. Like I think it's more important in this KEP to keep it as clear as we can without having to write new policies or make substantial additions or move or changes to the existing policies.
I do like the idea of at least enumerating that a critical security fix to go in during this window is one that has a CVE number assigned, and the security committee or security team has proposed it specifically for backport, that they are the instigating stakeholder or the initiating stakeholder there.
I think that seems like a short enough, that's something you can, you just summarized it in like 2 sentences. So that seems short enough to include, but like, I think, that all I'm worried about is that we'll end up with like a whole page sort of documenting the exact way the security exception policy works, when that's not really the intent of what we're trying to do. We just need to, here, I think the important part is to signal intent rather than working out all the details.
I personally think that if you limit backports to security patches only, a lot of consumers are not going to be happy with it. Because
that's only in that last 2-month period where it's technically kind of out of support, and you've had a year, right? Like, and this is your grace period in the case that your that your upgrade is taking longer than you thought or something like that. Like, really, the messaging needs to be, you've got a year. The year is the cadence you should be upgrading on. There's a bit of slack space there for if something goes wrong, but you should be aiming for about a year. I don't know. Is that more clear, Lubomir?
Maybe I missed the initial question from Deval. Was this whole discussion about the last 2 months of the LTS cycle?
12 plus 14 months is 12 plus 2, right? So this is plus 2 months after a year.
So in
This
the
is
last
period, upgrade period that we call right now.
So the last 2 months, we are only going to allow security patches.
Yeah. I mean, that's that was the initially, even by design, that was what we wanted to do in the extra overflow period. But we keep sneaking in different kinds of patches today. This kind of gives a headway towards whenever we start implementing this KEP, we can define a stricter policy with saying exception and creating an exception route, similar to what we do today for enhancements and other KEPs proposals today in the SIG release cycle. So
I must have missed something. So are you saying that we make patch releases to Kubernetes releases that are not security patches?
Yes, we make bug fixes. We make trivial to serious bug fixes, and SIGs decide those today. So this particular trust.
Okay. But bugs and security, I can totally understand, especially critical bugs, and there's a fine line between a critical bug and a security fix, I guess. But presumably we're not actually adding features or changing APIs or doing anything nasty like that.
In general, no, but practically, like sometimes, I think it does happen. It does what's happening is that sometimes some things that get backported are, kind of featurey, and that's what Tim was saying. But the important part here for us is that the 1 year is like the same as we currently do for 9 months in terms of upgrade, in terms of backports. It's just that there's 4 releases instead of 3. And then this extra 2-month period is taking the sort of implicit soak/baking period that we have now that's not documented anywhere and documenting it lightly to say, hey, there's also this slack period where there definitely won't be anything that's not, a real critical security backport in the oldest release for that last.
I understand what we're trying to say. Sorry.
And there are, so just to add one kind of bit of data, there's 2 patterns I see where API changes have happened on the patch release branches. The one is escapes. There was a goof there that wasn't covered by something. The other, and I think that's relatively uncommon actually, the other, which is more common, is with the cloud provider specifically when they add something. And this is often something that blurs the line between a feature and a bug fix. And there's been a historical bias to allowing the cloud providers to do what's right for their area and their customer set. And this is a fuzzy, subjective thing. I'm not a fan of it, but ultimately it won't matter because the cloud providers are getting broken out and they will be able to run at whatever cadence they want to. So part of that forward intent, I think, to break the cloud providers out had allowed things to be a little bit less rigorous. I won't say a little more sloppy, a little less rigorous in the cloud provider portions of the code base. So Azure might choose to introduce something, VMware might choose to introduce something, Amazon, Google, etc. But we've also tended to push back, and I'd say it's about 50-50 where we say like, hey, y'all should carry this yourself in your own patches for your platform versus actually going ahead and letting it in.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I guess to some extent, it may be a side effect of the delay that you mentioned earlier, which is that the big cloud providers are already almost a year behind on their stuff. So I can quite imagine if you bring out like super duper feature X on your cloud, and that means you're going to have to wait 2 years before your customers see it through their Kubernetes cluster, that's like a big problem. Whereas if they were doing quarterly upgrades, the problem becomes less significant.
If you look at the survey data, we have data also from other independent users who are not using any cloud or who are using cloud, but they are representing themselves as users. And they have mentioned that they are actually even further behind than the cloud providers. These people are some of these are just running Kubernetes in their on-prem machines without any cloud provider support. So yeah, I mean, it kind of extends your point, Queenet. I just want to remind that we only have 2 minutes left for the meeting right now. And
there was a really quick thing that I just wanted to add on to everyone's radar to think about, and just to have it in the minutes, is to say, like, we're coming up, you know, it's a couple of months, it's a few months now until we're going to present this KEP as sort of the output of the working group. I do think it's time that you know, especially those of us who have been active the whole time, like, think about, like, what are we going to suggest happens to the working group post the sort of original timeframe, which was a year. You know, once we've submitted this KEP, what happens to this working group? I mean, I personally think that there's still, you know, that as I said before, there is value in, you know, having something like this running on a longer term basis than just 1 year. But, you know, I just wanted to say, could everyone just have a think about what they think about where we go after that KEP is done?
yeah, I would suggest let's take this discussion on working group Slack channel or over the email or in the next meeting. Right now, we just have 1 minute. We are actually out of time, 10 a.m. So I would.
That's okay. Literally, I just wanted to say, think about it, you know, and then talk about it next time.
Thank you, everyone, for joining the meeting. That's it for today.
Thanks for running things. Excellent. Very useful.
Thank
Ciao.
you.
Thanks.